Gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. Of course, I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today I am joined by the Falcoholic himself, Dave Choate. We're going to talk about if a big veteran signing is on the horizon for the Falcons ahead of training camp, if Marcus Mariota is being disrespected, and what are some key camp competitions that Dave will be focused on this summer.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com. RIP, still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans. And, of course, the host of this preeminent Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And I thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available Monday through Friday on your preferred podcast platform, whether that be Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify. And of course, you can check us out on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube. Hit that bell, give us that like, and you will get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So as you guys are watching this or listening to this, maybe you're not listening to it, but we are live here on YouTube. We don't do too many live shows on the YouTube platform, but I figured, we're having Dave Choate on. Why not have it live? It's the eve of training camp. Players report on Tuesday, as many of you are listening to this, but on Monday night, we're breaking things down, and that will give us an opportunity to have you guys contribute in the chat. I know sometimes you guys jump in the chat and you're asking questions, and sometimes I respond to them on these various shows, but tonight you'll get an opportunity to get your questions answered by myself and or Dave towards the end of the show before we get into the meat of today's conversation, talking about if there's a big signing on the horizon, Marcus Mariota being lowballed in some of these quarterback rankings, as well as sort of camp competitions and potential breakout players. I know some of you guys will be, talking it up in the chat, but we'll get to the sort of open-ended portion of the show towards the end of today's episode. So later in the show, I'll sort of ask you to submit your questions and we can answer those. But if you, send in them into the chat this early in the process, they'll probably get forgotten by the time we get to that portion of the show. But with all that out of the way, Dave, my friend, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's jump into the meat of today's conversation. And, Eddie Goldman retired not too long ago, and that led to a potential vacancy on the Falcons defensive line, potential vacancy elsewhere. A lot of people have been, chomping at the bit to see the Falcons address their trench play a little bit further than they have so far, whether that's a defensive lineman, whether that's an offensive lineman to come in and also compete for a starting position. They did work out a couple of sort of cornerbacks that aren't necessarily big names. Cortez Davis, an undrafted free agent out of Hawaii, and DeMarcus Acey, who's kind of bounced around the league the last couple of years on various teams' practice squad, was injured with the Steelers last summer. Do you think, Dave, that there's going to be sort of a big signing on the horizon? As we're sitting here, most people are listening to this on Tuesday, the Falcons will announce a big move, either at the eve of training camp, similar to what they did last year with Jason Spriggs, or potentially in the early days of camp to address some of these issues.
Yeah, I think we might see something in the early days of camp. I've been a little surprised, honestly, that there hasn't been a signing. I thought, especially after Goldman retired, which is not something the organization could really foresee happening, like they might be eager to fill that spot with a name that got people excited ahead of training camp. But instead, apparently, we might see a young defensive back added if those workouts are any indication. But I do think that this team, more than most in the league, really needs a hard look at who they have in-house. And I think that there's probably an urge for them on both lines, really, to kind of figure out over the next week or so, who do we really have? And obviously, you've had the offseason program. Some of these guys, they've been in the building for years, and last year with this coaching staff. But for like Jalen Mayfield, for Matt Hennessy and Drew Dahlman, for Taquan Graham and Marlon Davidson. Like, these are guys who you want to see what they look like this summer. You want to see how much progress they've made, whether they're ready to step into huge roles, and that probably determines your need to some extent. That said, they signed Goldman, so clearly they felt that they needed some help on the defensive line. So I don't think we have heard the last of this. I think it just might be a few days, a week on the outside, a couple of weeks before we see some of those additions. These guys are still out there. Some good free agents on both lines. Certainly my preferred signing, Quentin Spain, is still out there at left guard. The Falcons, again, seem dead set on giving Jalen Mayfield every shot to win that job, and I really hope that works out for a million reasons. But if it doesn't, I guess they still have a fallback option. But I think the likeliest scenario is we get a couple of additions here in the next couple of weeks as they cycle through guys on the end of the roster, get a better look. And then, just based on what Terry Fontenot's done to this point, what he's said publicly, I think once we get to cut downs toward the end of the summer and a lot of guys shake loose from other teams, that's when you might see a couple of additions right before the season of guys that they like. Because I just don't, there's been guys out there they could have signed this whole time, and they've been very deliberate about it. So I don't think there's going to be that big rush tonight.
Okay. Well, my follow-up question was going to be, where do you want to see that addition come? And you seemingly answered it with Quentin Spade and bringing in that competition for Jalen Mayfield. How, I guess on a scale of 1 to 10, what is your level of concern for that left guard position as we sit here today?
Based on last year, it's like a 12. Based on, assuming that it can't possibly get worse, knowing that clearly the staff really believes in Mayfield. They gave him that extended shot last year. They clearly are invested in him to some extent. Like, I guess it would be more like a 7. I think there's the possibility, at least a remote one, that he is much better this year. He does kind of blossom into a good starter. We've seen this happen, not necessarily there, but with other players in the past. They've had bad rookie seasons. They've come into their own in their second year. But I'd be lying if I said I thought that was likely. And so when you have a fallback option that's familiar to the staff, good player, established player in the league, it's a concern to me that there doesn't appear to be a backup plan right now, and it'll be more concerning if somebody like Spain disappears in the next couple of days to another team.
Yeah, definitely. We'll have to keep that situation monitored. I've been trying to keep my Jalen Mayfield slander to a minimum this offseason, which I'm saving it all for September. So we'll just sort of see how that develops, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the training camp competitions. Maybe one of them include the offensive line, and Dave sort of keeping his eye on that, as well as sort of Marcus Mariota getting lowballed on some of these various quarterback rankings, whether it's the Athletic or Madden ratings. If you're into that sort of thing, we'll talk about that as we continue today's episode, guys. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about Dave. And I'm not talking about the guest I have in front of me. Dave is a banking app that can help you get $500 instantly with extra cash. And that's great for those of you that are in a tight pinch financially. We've all been there where you're living paycheck to paycheck and you're worried about those unexpected expenses coming up for you, and money's going to be a little tight, and Dave is there to sort of be that sort of safety net for you. You can get $500 instantly with their extra cash. There's no interest, there's no credit check needed. Millions have already downloaded the Dave app, and you can too, just by going to the App Store and downloading Dave right now. That's DAVE, and all you got to do is sign up for an extra cash account and get $500 instantly. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer fees apply. Banking provided by Evolve, member FDIC. Trust me, your future you will thank you. So, guys, I want to once again thank you guys for checking out Locked On Falcons as your first listen each and every day. I always have recommendations for what your second listen should be, including shows like Locked On Hawks to get the latest on them, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, etc., as part of this Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. But moving the conversation into Marcus Mariota, the Athletics quarterback tiers dropped earlier today on Monday, and that's sort of a thing that if you've been listening to this podcast the last several months, we've sort of mentioned it as sort of where will Marcus Mariota sort of land in those rankings. I was kind of thinking maybe in that 24, 25, 26 range, given expectations. found out he's 31 out of the 35 quarterbacks. And for those of you guys that aren't necessarily familiar with what that is, basically Mike Sando over at The Athletic talks to 50 NFL personnel, coaches, executives, all these various people, the people that are supposed to have, good opinions about football and be in the know, and basically ranks quarterbacks in like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 5, etc., and then sort of tallies up all the rankings and then stacks the thing. If you're curious where Matt Ryan finished in that, he was 14 in that group, as part of, I think, the tier 2 or tier 3 guys near the top of that list. But Dave, I'm curious. We've seen, some of these rankings. I think Marcus Mariota was the 30th on the Madden ratings, if you're into that sort of thing. I've seen other rankings that sort of say the Falcons have the worst quarterback situation in the league. Do you feel like people are disrespecting Marcus Mariota given some of these rankings, or do you feel like 31 in that range is kind of fair for him at this point in time?
I do want to just say really quickly that I appreciate you specifying that I was not instantly going to give anybody $500, and that was the app. So I did have a moment to panic hearing that. But Mariota, the thing with Mariota, I think, is he is sort of forgotten, as we briefly talked about before the show. It is kind of a question of, is he not that great? And I don't think he's going to be a great quarterback this year for the Falcons. I think that, at best, he's probably going to shake out to be league average or a little bit above, which would be terrific. Falcons are probably going to win some games if that happens. But I also don't think he's, the 31st best quarterback in football. I think this is really more a case of, being benched maybe under Arthur Smith, who is now his head coach in Tennessee, not really making more than spot starts the last couple of years. I think that's sort of out of sight, out of mind, and certainly looking at this Falcons offense and what it did a year ago, I think the expectations are probably low when you subtract Matt Ryan and you add in somebody who, again, hasn't been a full-time starter for a couple of years. But I do think that underrates him a bit. I think, like you said, putting him in the mid-20s, maybe early 20s if all goes really well, is more fair in my mind towards what his talent can be. And I certainly think in an offense that they're hopefully building to his strengths, one would expect that he's going to look a lot better than that by the end of the year. So I think, it's maybe unfair, and I think by the end of the year it will look unfair in hindsight, but I also understand the thought process here, which is we haven't seen him in a couple of years. He was benched the last time we saw him for another quarterback, going to potentially a low upside offense. It's hard to believe in that working out spectacularly. So, long-winded way of saying it's a little low, I think.
Yeah. It's not something I'm going to sit here and be like, this is, pull a Stephen A and be like, this is an injustice, this is ridiculous, or anything like that. Like, again, probably, I feel like probably maybe a few spots higher than he was. But, I do think given, the expectations that the Falcons didn't have a great offense with Matt Ryan and the expectations that this is a downgrade at the position. We already talked about some of the concerns on the offensive line, and Mariota historically has not been playing his best football when he didn't have necessarily great protection in front of him. I think it's fair to have some questions about what he has. But as I've mentioned a number of times on this podcast, like I think, there's optimism that you could see Mariota kind of be a lateral move from Matt Ryan, where we didn't see Matt Ryan have one of his best seasons in the league. And I think depending on what metrics you were looking at, he was kind of like the somewhere in that 15 to 18 range as a quarterback in terms of his efficiency. And I think, if you're being optimistic, I think you can say that Mariota has that type of potential if you can get significant improvements from this offensive line with some of the weapons that the Falcons have added, with the defense playing better. You could see that sort of upside with Mariota, and we'll just sort of have to see if he can deliver on that. And, one of the issues surrounding Mariota is going to be whether or not the situation between him and Desmond Ridder, about to call him DeMarcus, Desmond Ridder, and sort of how big a competition, how real that competition is going to be for that starting quarterback. I think everybody assumes that Mariota will be the week 1 starter, but we'll sort of see if Ridder can sort of close the gap and give the Falcons some optimism that, should Mariota prove himself to be, one of the 3 to 5 worst starters in the league that they could turn to Desmond Ridder and he could be an impactful player. But that's sort of as a way to get us to our next topic of conversation, which is, which are these quarterback, or whether it's the offensive line or any position group, which competition are you really going to be keyed on as we get started in the early days of training camp as it kicks off this week?
Yeah, there's so many. I'll focus on a couple because almost all of them are legitimately interesting for one reason or another, which is fun. It's not the sign necessarily of a great roster, but it's fun, and we want that too. So quarterback is obviously one of them. I think if Ridder looks better than anticipated and really does push Mariota hard for the starting job, even if he doesn't win it, that's an awesome sign. So I'll be hoping to see that and see him play well along with Falcoholic crush Felipe Franks in his new role at tight end / quarterback. I also will be watching the inside linebacker group really closely. I think even not knowing what's going on with Deion Jones at all, not necessarily expecting him to be here, you have potentially 5 guys, competing for 2 starting jobs. And I think Michael Walker and Rashaan Evans will probably win those 2 jobs, but it's not based on anything more than kind of a pre-camp hunch at this point. That looks like it'll be a good, fairly level competition, whether or not Jones is in it. And then the third one for me is going to be the safety group. And, I have a lot riding on Richie Grant. I think breaking out a little bit this year, being a much better player than he was a year ago. I fully expect it. I've been saying that for a while. So I'd like to see him and Jalen Hawkins win those starting jobs at safety. And, otherwise they're probably going to be resetting the position next year, which would be concerning. So I'm going to be watching that competition closely and hoping they win as well. But, from wide receiver to running back to certainly all along the offensive line, there's ton of stuff to watch. It's almost overwhelming, honestly.
Yeah, I think that is kind of the situation. For me, the offensive line is going to be probably the focus for me. Although, as you say, there's a lot of position groups where you could, talk about, the competition going on and sort of things being up in the air and whether certain players will step up. And that will be sort of our next topic of conversation. Dave mentioned Richie Grant as a possible breakout player, and we'll get into that topic coming up. But that's also going to get us into the sort of portion of today's live episode. One of the benefits of doing this thing live is, we can respond to the chat in real time. So if you guys do have some questions, this is the time where you can start submitting them in the chat here on YouTube. And now I'll actually start paying attention to what you guys are saying, and we can sort of answer some of those questions live. So we'll get into that as we continue today's episode. But before we get there, guys, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, which is Locked On Falcons is part of, as well as several of the other local shows like Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves, and Locked On Bulldogs. But really, Locked On Sports Atlanta is where you can find 3 shows with 4 hosts giving you their perspective on all of local sports as well as national headlines. That's A to Z with Mark Zeno, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanitra Batiste, breaking down everything related to Atlanta sports and culture and all that and more. And of course, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta on your preferred podcast app, all the same ones that you're checking out Locked On Falcons currently, including on YouTube. And if you check out Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube, you can also check out the Locked On Braves postcast, where Locked On Braves is breaking down every Atlanta Braves win and loss. And of course, this season we'll be doing postcasts here on Locked On Falcons, breaking down every Falcons win and loss. So make sure you subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta ahead of time to check that out as we continue today's episode. So, Dave, you already mentioned Richie Grant as a potential player that you're excited to see what he can do this upcoming season after a pretty lackluster rookie season. Is he sort of your guy that you look at with breakout potential, or are there other names that you add to that list as guys that you're really excited about what the potential that he can bring this season for this Falcons team?
Yeah, Grant is the big one for me. I look at Richie Grant as somebody who, for a million reasons didn't get on the field as much as we thought a year ago. But I think the talent is there. I think the opportunity here this year is going to be huge for him, and I think he'll step up and deliver. So that's one of the reasons I'm more excited about this defense than I was a year ago, believing that Grant will provide something that Harris and Harmon, well, perfectly competent, really couldn't, which is that playmaking spark that they've been missing. at safety for a bit now. So he's definitely on the list, and I'm hoping that in year one, I don't know if rookie breakouts count, but I'm going to throw Arnold Ebiketie in there. I think that he could have, probably not a 10-sack year, but certainly a productive year, much more productive than anything they had at outside linebacker a year ago. And I think that'll be viewed as a great breakout season. And then, I guess it's kind of cheap to say this, but Kyle Pitts, I think last year we saw Kyle Pitts scratching the surface of what he can do. I think with hopefully a little bit better supporting cast, knock on wood, and the coaching staff being a little bit more comfortable, him being a little bit more comfortable in his second year, I think he's going to make that first year's production look fairly weak. So that, to me, he's a candidate to break out even further than potentially he did in his first year. So there's not a lot of other great names there. I guess throw Jalen Mayfield in there just in case he does break out. I'll keep mentioning that, but yeah.
Got to cover all your bases with Jalen Mayfield breakout potential. Yeah.
As many as possible. Yeah.
Yeah. You didn't mention Caleb McGarry as a potential breakout, and we got a listener in the chat asking, basically saying, Aaron is all alone on Caleb McGarry Island. I've hopped on Fetty Island. I guess, Dave, where are you at with that potential competition at that right tackle position? Who are you sort of putting your money on as being the sort of guy that emerges this year?
I like the emoji usage on that, so that's great. But so I actually do have McGarry winning that. I don't know if I would classify him as a breakout candidate. I'm still not sure they're going to get great play out of him, but I do think that, I expect better from him this year. I think the competition hopefully will light a bit of a fire under him, and that in a contract season where we'll see his best. So my expectation is he's going to have that job week one, and he should be able to hold it, barring injury. Again, maybe not a breakout campaign where they have to fork over a huge contract, but I do think he'll do enough to make them strongly consider it. So, and it's overdue, but I think McGarry Island can be repopulated. So.
Yeah, it's not a great place to be. That's the theme I always say, it's a 2-star resort at best on McGarry Island. So I'm always looking for a potential upgrade. So if a Fetty Island winds up being a better place, I'm all for, getting that SOS out there and people coming to rescue me and bring me over to the adjacent
So you're
island.
actually stranded on McGarry Island.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, there aren't better options, and hopefully, there will be potentially better options, whether that's Caleb McGarry doing a better job and, upgrading, doing some maintenance on the resort, or, maybe they have a continental breakfast now moving forward, or whatever the case may be. Maybe they're actually cleaning the sheets or whatever that is. I'll take what I can get at this point in time with this Falcons offensive line. But we got another listener question from Cameron Christie. And you sort of mentioned this, Dave, about the possibility that Richie Grant doesn't have that sort of breakout potential this year, whether or not the Falcons could be looking at other safeties. And I think a lot of people are looking at this Jesse Bates situation in Cincinnati and monitoring that. And Cameron asked, do you think Jesse Bates is going to leave Cincinnati? And if so, is he a target for Atlanta? Is that a situation, Dave, as I can add further context to this, is that a situation that we should keep an eye on as a potential opportunity for the Falcons to make a big splash in their defensive secondary? Or is that sort of a situation that, maybe a little bit unrealistic at this point in time?
It might be a little unrealistic, but I definitely think it's a situation to keep an eye on. I think it's certainly possible that Bates exits Cincinnati. I think he'd be a great addition for the Falcons, and I think the Falcons, really, if we're thinking about where they're supposed to be in their timeline and what they need to do to get this team to the next level, they have to add more talent, more playmakers. We can quibble with the job the front office has done to this point. We can quibble with where the coaching staff's at. I think we'll continue to do that, but at the end of the day, they need more impact players. They're going to be sitting on a small boatload of cash, not the same boat rescuing you from McGarry Island, but a different boat. So any way you look at it, if somebody like Bates does become available, and this is a situation that he's not going to be there anymore, he's looking for a new home, I think Atlanta could make a ton of sense. I don't really believe that both Grant and Hawkins are going to break out and be above average to great safeties. I have really high hopes for Grant. I have solid hopes for Hawkins. So I think you would look very hard at adding a player of Bates's caliber if it's at all possible. I just don't know how likely it is.
Yeah, the Bates situation is one that's interesting to me. Obviously, he's one of the top playmakers in the league. Everybody who watched the playoffs last year saw he was a big part of why the Bengals, were able to make that Super Bowl run a year ago, and certainly one of the best free safeties and one of the best ball hawks in the NFL. So obviously, a huge upgrade. No offense to Richie Grant or Jalen Hawkins, but Jesse Bates is one of the best safeties in the league. We don't really know that about the current two options. So certainly a reason to be hopeful and optimistic that somebody could wind up landing a superstar at this point in time. But you do wonder, given the Falcons' timeline, are they going to be as aggressive, making some of those big bold moves before next offseason when they have a windfall of cash? Obviously, Bates is playing under the franchise tag. For those of you guys that aren't familiar with that situation, he's basically refusing to play under the franchise tag, and so that kind of puts him in Cincinnati at a stalemate, because basically his options are either to play under the franchise tag to sit out the season, or for the Bengals to accommodate a trade. And I'm sure Jesse Bates would like to have that third option be the situation so that he can get his money. But obviously, I think Cincinnati is going to be like, nah, we kind of need you back here. So it's up to you, Jesse, if whether or not you're going to show up. So I think it's certainly a situation to keep an eye on. But right now, I wouldn't be overly optimistic that the Falcons are about to swing a massive blockbuster trade for Jesse Bates moving forward. A couple more questions we want to get into before we wrap up today's live episode. This one comes from Adventure Often. He has, who are some of the undrafted free agents we picked up that you think could be a sleeper? He mentions Derek Tangelo, the defensive tackle out of Penn State. Who you got, Dave?
I actually really like Tangelo. He's somebody I see certainly as a strong practice squad candidate, potentially making the roster. I think we look at the defensive line; it's really not a settled situation at all. Beyond Grady Jarrett, there's a lot of guys that I have some level of intrigue or interest in, but to me, he's potentially good enough to kind of make that last spot on the defensive line and have a further impact down the line. So I'm definitely keeping an eye on him. I really like Kuoni Deng at outside linebacker as well. I think that's a thin group they have there. There's not really anybody beyond the top four that excites me necessarily. So he's got a shot of making the roster. I think he's fairly raw, but has a ton of potential, and you could certainly afford to develop him, this year a bit if you do keep him around again on the practice squad or the roster, because I expect all four of the guys that they have atop the depth chart to play a lot. So I don't think you'll need to rush him there. But those two I like quite a bit. I also think that somebody to keep an eye on potentially might be Leroy Watson, kind of the converted tight end to tackle. And I think that he's an interesting developmental guy too. It might take some time to make that transition work, but he's intriguing kind of as an athlete who I think has the fundamental strength to play the position well. So, and again, we don't know if there's going to be anybody returning at right tackle a year from now. So if you've got a developmental guy that's worth his salt, I think he could be it.
Yeah, I think this undrafted class is an interesting one. I usually don't pay too much attention to the undrafted free agents. I kind of just like, yeah, they're all fine, and wait to see if someone emerges, because basically trying to project, who's going to be that undrafted superstar that we get every single summer is nearly impossible. It's just throwing darts at the board. Like, everybody thought it was going to be JB and Hawkins last summer, and he quickly went by the wayside. And who thought Felipe Franks would be win the hearts and minds of Falcons fans, and especially Arthur Smith last year. But I think certainly some of those pieces in the front seven, like a Derek Tangelo, Kuoni Deng, you mentioned Nate Landman, those are probably the guys that have the best chance of sticking on the roster. But always intrigued to see sort of if those offensive linemen, given the question marks that the Falcons have at those positions, if one of those guys can emerge and be the next sort of Ryan Schrader, to sort of emerge from out of nowhere and be a real asset for this team who desperately need all the help they can get on the offensive line. So whether that's Tyler Vrabel or Leroy Watson, I'm all open for that moving forward. And I think we'll wrap up our last question with another one from Adventures Often. He asked, with Drake London and Kyle Pitts, do you think Bryan Edwards is lined up for a breakout season he will see lots of attention, and he says decisively, but I think he correct that as defensively, a lot less attention defensively. What are your thoughts on Bryan Edwards, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, I like that trade a lot. I thought it was low cost, high upside type of trade. I think Edwards is a good player. I'm not expecting I guess it depends on what your definition of a breakout season is. Like if you're thinking 80 grabs and 800 to 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns, like I would be a little bit dubious about that. I think beyond London and Pitts, there's going to be more of a focus on leaning on the ground game. I think Patterson's still going to be a factor. Anthony Ferkser's here now too, so there's going to be a split of both, how this team operates the offense in terms of hopefully running more and more effectively, and also spreading some targets around. All of that said, and I saw the response there. Yeah, I think 500 to 800 yards, 5 or 6 TDs, plenty of targets. I think all of that is well within reach for Edwards, and I do think he'll benefit from having a couple of big guys who take up a lot of attention. So it'll, if that's kind of the standard we're looking for a breakout season, which would be a really good season, I think absolutely that's within reach for him.
Yeah, part of me sits here and wonders if, while we're sitting here excited about what Drake London could be, if maybe Bryan Edwards is better positioned to have that sort of to be that sort of number 2 guy opposite Kyle Pitts as sort of the go-to threat in the offense, given his experience, given that we know traditionally wide receiver is not a position that is known for guys hitting ground running. Obviously, we've seen some guys, particularly guys from LSU the last couple of years, come in right away in the league and be dominant players. But it's not necessarily something that most players are known for. And so you wonder about Drake London that fit. You also wonder, the connection that Bryan Edwards has with Marcus Mariota. If Mariota is going to be the starter, the fact that, him and Edwards have been practicing together for the last couple of seasons means that rapport is ready to go right off the bat, and sort of concerns about, fit in the offense. Like, Bryan Edwards played that X wide receiver role for the Raiders, which is sort of the featured part of this Arthur Smith derivative Kyle Shanahan offense. We saw Julio Jones, we saw AJ Brown really shine in that. Obviously, I think the expectations long term are that Drake London will sort of fill those shoes as that go-to playmaker in the offense. But given Bryan Edwards has the experience, part of me sits here and wonders if, maybe Bryan Edwards is kind of that sleeper guy that could, surprise a lot of folks and come in right away, and maybe at least for the first month of the season, maybe the sort of key breadwinner at that wide receiver position in target. So that's something I go back and forth. Obviously, we'll just sort of have to wait and see how ready Drake London is this summer, how quickly Bryan Edwards has sort of picked up the offense and is ready to go, all those various things, as well as the other various receivers in the mix, Damiere Byrd, Olamide Zaccheaus, Auden Tate, Geronimo Allison, etc. So it'll be an interesting group of wide receivers this year. But part of me does wonder, are we sort of sleeping on Bryan Edwards to a certain extent, as maybe could be, potentially the Falcons lead receiver. So the idea, if someone ran up to me and said, "Hey, Aaron, I'm from the future, and Bryan Edwards has, 80 catches and 1,000 yards this season," like I wouldn't, my first instinct would not to be dismiss them as a crazy person. I'm like, oh, maybe you are actually from the future, because I could see a scenario where that plays out this year. So that will be something to keep an eye on as things unfold this summer. And Dave, now that we're sort of wrapping things up today, what are some other things that people can keep an eye on over at the Falcoholic this summer, as the number one SB Nation website for the Atlanta Falcons is unveiling their complete training camp coverage. I'm sorry. Usually I'm done talking once we get to 30 minutes and my brain starts working. So Dave, go ahead and plug Falcoholic and what's on deck over the next couple of days and weeks.
No, I appreciate the number one plug. That worked for me, so it was great. And yeah, I think, we're hoping on the Falcoholic Live with Kevin Knight, and hopefully all of us here as well at times. We'll have some more undrafted free agents on, maybe a couple of other Falcons players and coaches to kind of talk through the training camp experience and expectations for the season ahead. I'm excited to get some more opinions on that. And we'll have a lot of coverage from camp. I believe Everett Glaze, Kevin Knight, and Will McFadden will all be there at one point or another providing some coverage. Kevin will be there for about a week, so excited to bring you some firsthand observations there, and we'll continue to break down all of the different battles, and there's a lot of them to keep track of, and So it's going to be exciting. We'll just try to keep track of everything and get you ready for the season, whatever the season looks like.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to sort of which bandwagon Kevin jumped on this year. Last year it was Austin Trammell. Unfortunately, that didn't necessarily work out heading into this summer with the Falcons moving on from him a couple of weeks ago. But I'm eager to see sort of who's that guy that emerges and Kevin starts the I don't know, the Tyshawn James hive or something like that this summer. So we'll see how that goes.
I'm hoping Stanley Berryhill because I like his name, but I can't push him. It's got to be organic.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. I want to start the Jared Bernhardt hive. I'm really excited about him moving forward. So I'm hoping he lives up to those expectations as sort of a poor man's Julian Edelman. And for once, maybe we can get some revenge on the Patriots in the future with our very own Julian Edelman to sort of be like, we got our guy. So just wait. 6 years from now, when we're in the Super Bowl, you'll see. We'll get our revenge, but we'll see how that plays out, guys. I really appreciate you guys tuning in for a live episode. We'll be doing more of these throughout the summer, including some of these, preseason postcasts as the weeks unfold. Really enjoy this. Really dig the interaction. Of course, always subscribe to Locked On Falcons on your preferred podcast app, whether that be Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, of course, on YouTube as well, so that you don't miss any of these live shows moving forward. Always thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day, and always recommend a second listen for you guys to check out Locked On NFL, as they're covering all 32 NFL teams as training camps kick off for the vast majority of those teams all week long. So if you want to stay covered on what's the latest with Jesse Bates, in addition to Locked On Bengals, check out Locked On NFL moving forward, guys. I really appreciate you guys tuning in for another episode. We'll be back with more Falcons coverage as training camp kicks off on Tuesday on tomorrow's episode.